Welcome everyone to the last and best of the environmental conversations for the 2017-2018 academic year. I'm Chris Field. I'm the director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. It's a pleasure to have you here to participate in a two-way dialogue and environmental conversation where we'll have a chance to get behind the issues and behind the personalities of what makes science work and what can make science better in the future. It's a pleasure and an honor today to welcome Dr. Marcia McNutt. Marcia is the president of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the leading honorary society for science in the U.S., but also the official science advisor to the nation. It's a huge responsibility. Marcia's had an amazing career. She was an undergraduate at Colorado College and did her PhD at Scripps. And after brief stints at University of Minnesota and at USGS here in Menlo Park, she was a faculty member at MIT for a long period and became the Griswold Professor. Is a leading marine geophysicist where she works especially on the strength of the crust, and much of her work has been on something called the Pacific Superswell. And if I ever had to pick something that I would want to work on, it would be a superswell. You can ask her about that later. But after a distinguished career that involved more than 15 major ocean cruises, many of which she was the chief scientist on, she became the president and CEO of the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, where she oversaw the launching of their major marine vessel and the establishment of the first cabled undersea sensor network, and really put that institution on the map. In 2009, Marcia became part of the Obama administration's Dream Team in Washington, where she was the first woman head of the U.S. Geological Survey, where with a staff of just a few people shy of 10,000. She was responsible for essentially being what I think of as the nation's chief risk advisor, and she oversaw responses to a number of major disasters, including some huge earthquakes, and especially the Deepwater Horizon, where her work was really pivotal in figuring out what had happened and what could be done about it. Following a successful run at USGS, where the institution was really firing on all cylinders. In 2013, Marcia became the editor-in-chief of the Science family of magazines, where Marcia oversaw the launch of Science Advances, a new journal, and also the launch of Science Robotics and Science Immunology, really expanding that family. She also played a major role in building out what Science AAAS calls the front half of the magazine, where science is really for everybody and not just for the technical experts. And I think that made a huge difference in the way our community has understood our opportunities and our responsibilities for engaging with the public. And then beginning in 2016, she's been the president of the National Academy of Sciences, the first woman in that role, and has really been the leading advocate for science in an age of skepticism, and the person who I believe in this era of science skepticism has been more responsible than any other for demonstrating what science can offer and how science can offer it in an effective way. So join me in welcoming Marcia McNutt for Environmental Conversation. Marcia, it's really a thrill to have a chance to talk with you about your guiding principles and how it is that you have sort of set the trajectory through your career. There's pioneering achievement after pioneering achievement. Oh, I forgot about the underwater demolitions expert and the barrel racer part of her career. But tell me about how you thought about shaping a career in science, especially one with so many firsts.
Well, Chris, first of all, thank you for that over-the-top introduction. That was really something.
I think so.
Well, you know, I have to say that I know that there are some people who do set goals in their career and decide this is what I need to do and this is what I need to do next and this would be a good career move for me or whatever. But that wasn't me. Every job I ever had in my career, I thought was the best job ever, and that I was the most blessed person on the planet to have had the opportunity to have that job. And that if I could hold on to that position forever, it would be wonderful. And I never really aspired to anything else. I thought I would be a professor at MIT forever. And then I got the opportunity to go to the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute and be the leader there. And I thought I had died and gone to heaven, and that was the best job ever. And I really had to think long and hard when I was asked to interview to become the director of the USGS, because I was so happy at MBARI. And what actually made the decision for me was the fact that I came from a family that really believed in public service. And so I thought if there was any time that I was going to do public service, that was it. My youngest children had gone off to college, and so I was an empty nester. So I figured, well, I probably didn't have a reason why I couldn't do that job, and it was my responsibility to do it. So I left MBARI to go to Washington, and something kind of strange happened. I realized that I actually grew by taking on that new job. It was, although I missed MBARI and I missed all the people that I'd worked with, and MBARI was, of course, the best job in the whole world, still getting into a new organization with different people and a different mission was important for me intellectually. And so after I had spent time in the USGS and had accomplished, when I got there, I made my list of what I wanted to do there, the things I wanted to accomplish. And once I had checked those off, it made it really easy for me to then accept the job at Science magazine, because I remembered how much I felt I had grown by going to the USGS. And I felt the same thing would happen by going to Science, and then again by going to the Academy. So none of these were moves that I planned or had anticipated. Each of these jobs I thought I'd be at forever. But when a phone call came and someone said, would you be interested in doing this? Just that experience of going from MBARI to USGS made me think, this will be another growth opportunity.
The growth opportunities for sure, but pretty courageous and gutsy. Did you ever have any apprehensions about work on those big stages? That's something that I guess I'm just naturally a risk taker. Someone that anybody who does undersea demolitions and barrel racing.
Undersea demolition, skis black diamonds, and takes horses down mountains that we call Snowy River. Probably doesn't think about that.
Okay, but I'd like to talk a little more about the leadership aspects. My sense, sort of reading your background, is that when the leadership responsibilities really started building up, as in some of the early ocean cruises where you were the chief scientist, and what's your philosophy of helping a team work effectively and accomplish its goals?
Yeah, right. So first of all, I'm fond of saying that I think being the mother of identical twins is one of the best training experiences for being a leader, because when you have clones that are arguing over something and you have to resolve that conflict, that's when all of your negotiating skills are brought to the forefront, because each one of them is absolutely positive that she is in the right and that truth and justice is on her side. And you realize that there's nothing that separates them. One is not smarter than the other. One is not older than the other. One is not more talented than the other. There is nothing that you can use as a reason why one of them should get her way and the other one shouldn't. And so the only way you can do it is by helping them work through it until they get to a compromise that they both can live with. So I think that going through that with the twins helped me understand that leadership is all about building, number one, a shared sense of goal at the very highest level. So everyone has to say, whether it's on the expedition of the ship, what is it that we're trying to do on this expedition that we all agree would be our brass ring, our, would be the very best outcome we could possibly get from this expedition. And now, what do we agree is the role that each of us has to play in this if we want to get that? How do we each have our part, and how do we each know that this is the highest and best use of each of our talents in order to get it? And I think when people really see how they have their unique talents that they're going to bring, and everyone is working towards that same high goal, then you get really good teamwork and really good buy-in.
And how do you bring people around so that they can look at the big picture collective goals rather than the narrow personal goals?
Yeah, so I think you spend, that's all about spending time with people, realizing that they're much better off buying into the team goal than the personal goal, and how they align their personal goal with the team goal. Because people do have personal goals, and you can't ignore the personal goals. If you ignore the personal goal, there are people who are naturally unselfish and will do anything for the team. But there are also people that will understand that if working towards the team goal will also advance my personal goal, then I get the team helping me out towards my personal goal. So that's how you have to show them that this is the quick way to their personal goal.
And maybe you could say just a little more about the way you translate that leadership philosophy into style. Do you think about the persuasive component of that as being primarily a logical one or primarily an emotional one?
Well, it depends on what it often comes down to org chart. So, for example, you take someplace like Embari or the NAS. If people are reporting to me, I can just write it in their personnel descriptions and their job performances. So it's very easy. They can see that they're being evaluated on this, and by me aligning their personal advancement with the organizational advancement, they're going to thrive in the organization. Now, that doesn't work so well if, for example, you are out on a ship and you've got collaborators from another university who don't report to you, then you have to use the persuasive arguments. But you still have resources that you control. For example, they might want to be co-authors on a paper. Well, if they want to be co-authors on a paper and you're the chief scientist, then you have control over some key resources that are going to advance their careers.
So it sounds like, in general, the behavior that you've modeled is that once a group goal is clear, then you can use a range of strategies in order to get people to buy into that.
Right.
Let me change it to talk a little bit about the USGS and risk management. It seems like, as kind of the nations of the world's sort of key risk informant, it must be frustrating that we as a society, as individuals, do such a poor job of understanding and evaluating risks. And I wonder if your experience at USGS sort of gave you insight into how to do a better job of informing individuals, countries, companies about the nature of the risks we face from environmental hazards or from industrial hazards like the Deepwater Horizon spill.
Yeah. So if what you mean by that people's perceived risk doesn't match their real risk, that's true. People are, for example, very afraid of certain outcomes, like some people are deathly afraid of plane crashes when they're more likely to be in an automobile accident than they are in a plane crash. But I think some of this is actually rooted in some real human emotions that are hard to overcome. People believe that they have control over their car in a way that they don't have control over an airplane. So it's understandable that someone would feel like, I'm sitting in, seat 20D, and I have very little control over my airplane risk. Whereas if I don't use my cell phone while I'm driving, and if I don't drink while I'm drive, and if I make sure that my car is in good working order and I have good tires and things like that, I'm knocking out all sorts of risks to an automobile accident that otherwise other people might be exposed to. I think what is interesting, though, is to look at the different sectors of natural disasters and see the very different way that those communities have responded to risk. So the one I know best is the earthquake community, and that's very familiar to anyone living here in the Bay Area. I think the earthquake community has responded exceptionally well to the risk issue, given the fact that earthquakes are not now, and who knows if they ever will be, a predictable phenomenon from the standpoint of being able to give a short-term warning of when an earthquake is going to occur. And yet, here in California at least, people rarely die in earthquakes. And compared to the same magnitude earthquake elsewhere in unprepared communities, if there is a major earthquake, the death toll here in California is very, very low. And the reason is because of all the preparation that is done in terms of building codes, the community safety, public preparedness. People know here in California what to do to keep themselves safe. I contrast that with tornadoes. I grew up in the Midwest, and in a place called Tornado Alley. And where I grew up, when the tornado sirens went off, everyone went down into the basement, into the southeast corner. And you knew what to do, and you were safe down there, and chimneys would fall and windows would get blown out. But people didn't die that much when I was a kid. Now, because of construction actually going backwards, many homes don't have cellars anymore. There's mobile homes, mobile trailer parks, etc. People don't have a place to even go to for safety. And so now the same kinds of tornadoes actually do kill people. So that is another kind of hazard, which actually is more predictable than earthquakes, but the death toll is going in the opposite direction.
And I wonder if you could comment on the lessons from the way we think about earthquakes for, well, the tornado example is really interesting, but I was curious about how you think that we translate that risk to climate change, and arguably are way behind the curve in terms of the preparations we should be making.
Yeah. So I remember hearing a talk by Dan Gilbert from Harvard, who has written a number of books. One is on happiness. Another he wrote is on fear. Where does fear come from in the human brain? And he argues that our fear response has not caught up with modern society's current lifestyle, and we still have the amygdala of a caveman, basically. And he said that there are 4 basic reasons why we're not very good at responding to climate change. And he said there are 4 things that we are genetically wired to fear from our caveman ancestors. One of them is something coming at us really fast, like you duck when a rock's being thrown at you. And the problem with climate change is it's happening too slow. The other thing that we're taught to fear is something that is repulsive to us. So the example that Gilbert used was vivisection of puppies. You know, everyone would say if it's, you know, or in the case of climate change, if climate change were caused by cars driving down the road, pooping horse manure out of their tailpipes, rather than a colorless, odorless gas. Believe me, and the manure were piling up on the freeways, there would be a hue and outcry from the populace that something has to be done about this pollution from automobiles. The third thing he said is that humans are taught to revile evil when evil has a face. So the face of Adolf Hitler or the face of Osama bin Laden. But, you know, we've seen the enemy, and the enemy is us. And that's what makes it very hard to pin climate change on something else, on someone else. And then he said, finally, the last one is that we're with climate change, we're taught from our caveman ancestors to be suspicious of anything that looks different, anything that's very different than what it was. But with climate change, the difference is happening very slowly. So you almost have to go back and see things of what your grandparents saw. And now you see it again. And we just don't have enough of those memories to say and be able to say this is definitely due to climate change in order to fear it. So that's what
if I can push on that just a little bit, earthquakes don't have any of those four things either. They have historical.
Well, they're sudden. They're sudden, and buildings fall down and people die.
When they occur. But then there are long periods when they don't. And I guess that.
But this is, again, the problem with earthquakes is that, and floods, and a lot of these other tragedies that happen infrequently, is that you find people going and building houses, or even hurricanes. You go to the Outer Banks and here's someone putting a house back up again right where their father and their grandfather and their great-grandfather had to rebuild houses over and over again, is that human memory is rather short compared to the recurrence rate of many of these. And if it weren't in the earthquake case for actual public officials working with scientists to put in codes and building standards, the San Andreas would probably be built up wall to wall.
Right. I think it is really interesting that the key to earthquake preparation has been legislative action at the community or state or national scale.
Right.
And that's what we haven't really seen in the climate change domain.
Right.
The question of risk management also has a lot to do with communication and how messages get believed. And one of the challenges that I know you must face in being a spokesperson for science today is skepticism about the credibility of science. And how do you think about helping stakeholders across a wide range of perspectives understand what science is and why it should be credible?
Right. So, that's just such a difficult question because the first thing I'd say to that is everyone here, and I say this to everyone I talk to, every scientist I talk to, we all need to get out of our scientist bubbles and cultivate larger communities of non-scientists. Because I really get concerned when I hear these surveys that ask people to name a living scientist. And they can't name a single one. Or if they do, they say Albert Einstein, who's dead. Or they say Al Gore, who's not a scientist. So it's this isn't good. And I think too many of us scientists spend time, or sometimes they say they're family doctor, which is maybe not too bad because most doctors know a lot of science. But still, I think too many of us scientists live with other scientists and socialize with other scientists. And we need to spend more time talking to people who aren't scientists, letting them know that we are scientists, and also talking to them about what science really is. I think that the curriculum in schools is changing. But it used to be that science was taught as a string of facts. And then that really then would disturb people when they see coffee is good for you. Oh no, coffee's bad for you. Red wine's good for you. No, red wine's bad. No, red wine's good. This then confuses people and leads them to believe that scientists maybe don't know what they're talking about and science isn't to be trusted.
On the red wine issue, I agree with that.
Yeah. Yeah. So, if instead, I think the curriculum in schools is changing to show science as a ordered way of exploring the natural world to find out what are the laws that govern it. And so when I talk to people who aren't scientists, I say, if you adhere to the scientific method, you can be a scientist. Being a scientist is basically saying that you've got a hunch about something, you've got an idea, and you're willing to test it by proposing an experimental plan and checking your biases at the door and testing your hypothesis using an ordered method to see whether your hypothesis will stand up to evidence. And, I think that if more people felt that science wasn't this closed club, and that science is always moving forward and revising as more evidence becomes available, and that scientists do change their minds with more and better data, but it is always going in the positive direction towards better truth and more complete truth, that would undo some of this skepticism.
And how much do you think it's a problem that scientists are not reaching out to explain the things they do versus not really being careful enough to follow the scientific method in their own work?
Of course, there is enough bad science out there. I'm sure that happens. We just had a meeting a few weeks ago at Cold Spring Harbor on the topic of trust in science. And it was a very interesting meeting because we had people there from journalists from places like the LA Times and the New York Times and the Washington Post who cover science. And then we had people there from like Consumer Reports and from other organizations that are known for actually certifying good results, Crossref, places like that. And then we had some journal editors and people from Google and Wikipedia and other places like that. And and the way the discussion went was interesting because, first of all, as scientists, we do a horrible job, and we're getting worse at signaling within the community what we trust and what we don't trust. And we are absolutely silent about signaling outside our community what we trust and what we don't trust. So decades ago, it used to be science that has not yet been peer-reviewed is we say nothing about. It's not, it has no validity yet. Once it's been peer-reviewed, then we trust it. Then suddenly came many questionable outlets for scientific research. A number of journals that claimed peer review but maybe didn't do peer review, just took the author's money and pushed the papers out without doing it. Many journals that did maybe very shoddy or superficial peer review, journals that had lists of distinguished editors who didn't even know they were being listed on the journal as their editors, etc. And all this came out about journals not even doing plagiarism checks, etc. And now we realized, and then many papers being cited as preprints before they were even published. And we realized that our community has actually taken a step backwards in terms of what we're signaling, both internally and externally, in terms of what we trust. So the outcome of this meeting was we realized that we are at risk of losing the public trust if we don't do a better job of signaling which papers have gone through what gates along the way. I mean, we're certainly not going to rewind the clock because preprints are here to stay, and they've got their role, and they're doing some very good things. And many of these journals are here to stay, but there should be some kind of signals of what papers have been checked for bias, conflict of interest, IRB approval, peer review, etc. And all of these things should be clearly signaled.
I want to open it for audience questions after one more question from me, so you can start thinking about your question. But I want to follow along with this question of sort of the credibility of publications and ask about how you think about the National Academies reports, because you oversee an enterprise that is probably the world's leading provider of science synthesis. And what do you aspire to in terms of the added value from the National Academies reports?
Right. So this is something I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out where we're going with this since I became president of the National Academy. So my concern has been that the Academy puts out a number of very authoritative reports every year. Some of the reports have been the stuff of legend in terms of their impact. For example, it was an Academy report that launched the Human Genome Project. It was an Academy report that woke up the Reagan administration to the threat of an AIDS epidemic and made them actually do something about public health and developing treatments for AIDS. It was an Academy report that led to banning smoking on airplanes. There are a whole number of reports that had a huge impact. But there are a couple problems with our reports. Lots of problems. They take too long. They're too expensive. They are basically written for a specialist audience. And most of our evidence for impact is anecdotal. So I commissioned the first ever in the 155-year history of the Academy external review of how we're going about doing these reports. And it was delivered a couple months ago. And so we're in the process of revamping things so that we can do our reports in a more streamlined approach at a lower cost and with a distribution that is going to be more tailored to both the primary and secondary audiences for the report. and with a tracking system such that we will have more immediate and long-term information on what the impact has been of those reports that we can pull up both for us and for the sponsors of the reports, so that we'll know what's happening with them.
And I just have to ask one more, and I promise we'll go to you guys next. Do you basically think about the Academy's reports as kind of in some ways tying a ribbon around the scientific process, so that you really have a chance to evaluate what stood the test of time and what hasn't, and it's a way to look across thousands of papers rather than just have to evaluate paper by paper, or what?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The Academy reports tend to be at a certain time when that report is written. It tries to capture what is the consensus of the scientific community on a certain issue. What do they really think is the best available information? And there is hardly an Academy report that doesn't identify where there are gaps and what research program is needed to fill that gap. And so an Academy report is never a final word on a topic because of that gap analysis and what needs to be filled. What is increasingly being done, though, in these Academy reports is an evidence analysis that allows future groups to say, it's not worth revisiting this topic until there is enough new work filling this gap that is peer-reviewed, that has addressed these issues and has an evidentiary basis that rises to this level in terms of the significance of the results, such that it would be worth reconvening a group to look at the problem again. And this is really important for things like, you said the red wine issue. There's probably no area that the Academy deals with that is more fraught with bad science than nutrition. And I'm sorry if anyone here is a nutrition scientist. I'm sorry. But there really are, not at Stanford probably, but out there, a lot of charlatans who love to do a simple little underpowered study on, eating this or eating that, and they get some little result and they publish it. And they think now they have the final word on whether Cheetos are, good or bad for you or whatever. And there's just really a lot of not good science out there. And so this is one way that we kind of avoid having the chocolate lovers of the world come back to us and say, we think the Academy needs to reconsider it's probably not the chocolate lovers, but right now we're doing a report on sodium. And believe me, there are the potato chip manufacturers of the world who are really scared about this report. And when the report comes out, I'm sure they'll be coming back to us every year saying, isn't it time to relook at this? Isn't it time to relook at this? And so this is the way we say, well, here's the benchmark. When there are this many papers with this kind of credible evidence, then we'll relook at it.
Okay, so if there are any potato chip manufacturers out there, you're not welcome to ask your question, but everyone else is. And if you would wait for a microphone so that we can get a recording, and so we'll start over here. Thanks, Yanni.
Great. Thank you for a fascinating discussion. You started off talking about, the way that you like to approach people is to align their personal goals with the goals of the organization. And then from the organizational standpoint, you mentioned that we need to be doing more outreach to the public and things like that. How do you connect those two, especially as an early career scientist?
Okay.
Just like, how are we being rewarded for doing the things that you need to do?
Thank you for that question. Okay, so this is my personal view that I am very, very concerned that organizations today, most universities and most research organizations, have far too narrow a set of criteria that they are evaluating their researchers and their faculty on. They are evaluating them on usually a subset of their research portfolio that the researcher selects, and it's usually a number of publications that are in high-profile journals that have a large number of citations and good work that they may be doing in promoting their work to the public and raising the visibility of science and doing outreach and engagement. Unfortunately, I don't think is getting the recognition it needs. And I think we need to really expand the horizons of universities. And I would not advise a pre-tenure person to do that unilaterally, because it really has to be up to the universities to make this change, because it jeopardizes the career of an early career person to just do that. And then if they are not being evaluated on it, that's a problem. But let me tell you a story from when I was at the USGS. USGS had a much broader set of criteria for evaluating its scientists. And when I was director, we had the youngest person ever come up for the highest promotion of a researcher at the USGS, which was an ST promotion, which is a super grade. It's above GS 15, super grade. And the criteria were broad. You could have research publications, you could have outreach, you could have patents, you could have it was a broad set of things. You could have engagement, any number of things. And this researcher didn't have a lot of publications, but he had some computer codes he had written. And the computer codes resulted in things that were posted on web pages. And one of these was a program you may have seen. It's called Pager. And Pager you pull up whenever there's an earthquake, and it shows in logarithmic scales after an earthquake. It comes up within a minute or two of an earthquake. What's the likely death toll and what's the likely economic losses in an area. And to do that, he had to integrate the building codes and the population density with the geology in an area to get the shaking right. And when he came up for promotion, he had to have a couple outside letters on it. We had letters from the head of the American Red Cross, the head of the Earthquake Bureau in China, and someone else quantifying for us how many lives he had saved because of his work. And because of the fact that it told them whether every earthquake was a local response, a regional response, a national response, or an international response, and knowing that they got people out of the rubble and saved their lives. And, that's the kind of thing that it's really important to have broad criteria. It wasn't publications, he had very few. but he had impact.
Stick one here.
Thank you. I would appreciate, Marcia, if you could give some feedback about how you might think about a problem which is very challenging in science and people don't like to talk about. Mm-hmm. If you look at the biosciences, like at Cold Spring Harbor, where they look at cell and gene therapy, addressing many diseases that we're trying to cure, and jump up and out in time, maybe 15 years from now, and look backwards and say, what have been the major hurdles to making progress in this area? One of them would be patents, and the patent thicket sits surround that. And in looking for those cures, you have patients who are participating in trials, they're donating tissues, they provide parts of their body that are used in post-mortem analysis. So making major investments to support that science as well. I was wondering how you would think about the challenges that might be, how it might be approached from a university and a foundation perspective going forward. Right now, patents just aren't talked about much. If you're in a presentation that's be giving, a speaker might stop and say, I can't talk about that, or the slides can't be shared afterwards about this topic. A recent report that was in Neuron had 200 authors, and on that it listed about 10 different consortiums that were working together. And at the back of the paper, it had a list of 10 pages, which listed the affiliations of all the different researchers that contributed to identification of one gene. And you have universities who fight litigation battles over CRISPR as an example. But people aren't rewarded, are discouraged from cooperating on a basis in which patents will not be held as a matter of ransom. And this is
before there's plenty there. Let me let Marcia go before she loses the thread of where you started here. Thanks.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how much I really can comment on this because I don't think I have much background in the exact issues. I was at a NIST had a recent patent gathering in which they were looking at what within Bayh-Dole might need to be changed. And one area of concern is where in biomedicine things, but the issue there was more talking about cost rather than, I think, the issue that you're talking about.
Well, cost is part of that. You want cures that are timely and affordable. Right,
exactly. And one thing that I'm hearing, basically everywhere in the country is that when most of the basic research behind this has already been provided by the government, what is a reasonable cost for the investment that the biotechnology companies and the pharmaceutical companies have put in afterwards. And there is a report from the National Academy out. Have you seen that one from Norm Augustine?
Yes, the one that was about a year ago.
Yes,
that was a good report.
Yeah. So beyond that, I don't have much more to say on that. I'm sorry. It's a big problem, though.
Do you, if I could just, do you encourage the national academies to have public statements on key issues like science in the public interest or in integrity in science? How do you think about using the national academies as an amplifier of where the community is?
Yeah. So here's the tricky part of it. We only make public statements. We try not to make public statements that might be viewed as partisan. And you can imagine how difficult it is in the current climate in Washington to make a statement about just about anything that doesn't sound partisan. So let me give you a few examples of statements that we have made because we couldn't help ourselves. One was when the CDC was, it came out that the CDC was not to use evidence-based, in the words evidence-based, in their budget. We put out a statement on that. We felt banning words like evidence-based was something that we just couldn't be quiet about. We also put out some statements on immigration. When it was apparent that there was some backlash about students getting into the country and things like that. So we put out a statement on that. There might be one or two other issues that we have, but it's generally when there's something about the science. So even the one on immigration was just facts about immigration, not about the policy. So we try to stick to what are the facts. We do not tell the government what the policy should be.
Okay, next question. Right there. Thanks. Perfect.
Thank you so much for coming. I have a question about open access. I actually pretty recently read the little article you wrote about my love-hate relationship with Sci-Hub.
Sci-Hub. Yeah.
But I'm just curious, the push toward, you mentioned more transparency and public engagement with science. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about the movement towards open access and the role that plays, and also what you think the biggest hurdles and next steps are in getting all scientific information kind of available for the public eye.
Yeah. So there seems to be a general trend towards more and more journals going open access. Even the society journals most of them have a hybrid model, and they are and one might imagine a route to which eventually they would go from 25-75, where 25 is open access, 75 is not. Eventually, they flip over to being mostly open access. Here's what some of the issue is. In science, much of the work is done on grants, so paying the open access fee is not the issue. In social sciences, people don't have the funding to pay the open access fee. So when we started Science Advances, the open access journal, we had to set the price so that actually the sciences are subsidizing the social sciences. Because otherwise there would be no social science research in that journal whatsoever. And it really would not be good for the journal to completely ignore the social science work in climate change and, many other areas, economics and things like that. So that's one issue, and making sure that the prices are set that way is important. The other issue is, I think that there are a couple journals, the journals that have the big front matter, like Nature and Science, they just don't have a model for how to go OA. There's no way, because there's no way that the back part of the journal, which is that big, can support the front part of the journal, which is that big. It just doesn't work out financially. So how you would support a journal like that. OA, I don't know.
Let's take one over on this side. You pick, Devin.
It's been really fascinating discussion. I have questions on all of the elements, but I think I'll pick up on this issue. And my term as editor-in-chief of GRL is ending, so I'm out of conflict on this. Yeah, thank you. Chris has been encouraging that to happen for a while. So thanks for your wisdom. So the secular trends that I see are really in opposition to the goals that it sounded like were coming out of that meeting at Cold Spring Harbor that you described, which is maybe recognition of those trends is why the meeting happened. But authors want more, as I see, at least in the geosciences, the authors are moving more towards just posting on archive and cutting out the journals. I don't see that reviewers are excited about providing, they're being the labeling entity for saying this isn't wrong, we promise. And so if I think about 10 years from now, at least in the geosciences, it seems much more likely that the journals, including the society journals, will be publishing a smaller fraction, and the Earth Archive and whatever else rises up will be more of the portfolio. So I guess my question is, one, I guess whether you agree with those trends. If not, then I'm wrong. But if you do, then how do you see the burden of this, the validation for the public that you talked about earlier, when there's so much more momentum on this in our communities away from the peer review process?
Okay, so here's my thought. First of all, if imagine a world in which all we have is papers that are posted on preprint servers, and nothing's been peer reviewed except for some things have maybe some comments on them. And unfortunately, you know how that goes. I mean, I've published several papers now that first went on preprint servers and then were published in journals. And I'll tell you, there was a huge difference in the quality of what I got from the comments on the preprint server and what I got from the journal. When an editor actually put the thumb screws on someone and said, "Thou must make comments on this paper," wow. I mean, all my co-authors said the same thing. Wow, these were really important comments. This was stuff we had to hear. This paper improved 1,000%. And so there is a big difference in the quality of science when an editor gets a really good person to review your paper. So while I understand where you're coming from, Noah, I really hope that we will not get to this world where everything is posted on preprint servers and our colleagues do not spend the time reviewing our papers.
I agree with you. I'm pro journal,
Yeah.
but the headwinds are
Okay,
going in the opposite direction.
So I think that one thing that we as a community have to say is that if a paper is actually going to be counted, cited, etc., it needs to be peer-reviewed and published. For example, the Academy will not allow a paper to be used as a documentation for an Academy report unless it has been peer-reviewed. It is though it does not exist. It is though it does not exist. Now, at this Cold Spring Harbor meeting, we were under Chatham House rules, so I can't say which, but there was one journal that I think is doing a very good job. They are ingesting preprints automatically from a preprint server. They are putting them into a stream into their journal, and they are automating beautifully a lot of the plagiarism checks, a lot of the conflict of interest checks, a lot of the IRB approval checks, funder checks, stuff like that. All of these things can be then certifying the paper as having gone through all of these gates after it comes off the preprint server. And this journal does not even send it out for peer review until it has passed all these automated checks. Then they send it to peer review, and they also do a statistics check at some point, so that they don't even bother the peer reviewer with a paper that they know won't meet their standards because it's got some of these problems. And then at this Cold Spring Harbor meeting, we were imagining these papers being earning dynamic checks later, such as if a paper has been reproduced, it could get a check mark later for having been reproduced, or other things like that. But these would be things that could be add to the credibility of the work post facto.
And when we think about broadening the incentive structure for academics, I assume you'd support recognizing being an excellent reviewer as one of the things that ought to go into an evaluation.
Absolutely.
Let's swing back to this side.
Thank you. I would like to tie a few of the questions together and ask from the National Academy of Sciences, how much do you think about the enterprise of science in a holistic way? We've talked about peer review, we talked about the reviewing but one of the issues is that we've evolved into these incentive structures, right, that don't necessarily incentivize universities to ask professors to engage with communications and such. There's many. The science enterprise is far from perfect, and I wonder how much do you think about actively, trying to push some sort of recommendations, perhaps, because I don't think much would be done if we just leave it to the universities, kind of, to reform the incentives, right? So how much?
Except for Stanford.
Except for Stanford.
Yeah. So this is really good. So I had a conversation with a leader of a scientific society last night, who called me to talk about an egregious case of they were going to expel someone from that scientific society for some basically misappropriating funds in his research grants. And it was clear from reading the case that he sent me that there had been whistleblowers who had brought up this professor's poor ethics and poor and really illegal use of federal funds several times previously. And because he was bringing in, get this, $30 million a year in grant money, the university every time did an investigation and said that it was fine. And then finally it got to be too much and they fired him. But, I just think that there are some universities that are looking at the financial bottom line, and they are not looking at what is the ethical and the what is appropriate for the reputation of science. So this has really got to change. We have been discussing at the Academy putting together a group to look at this issue and see if we can get some leadership from some top universities to work on this as a because we figured if we could get enough university leaders together, that might be enough to make some changes.
And how do you think about this science enterprise in the context of the broader tenure and promotion criteria that you've advocated? What's going to make the universities begin to embrace that?
Well, this is all wrapped up with the public perception of science too. I mean, everything we've been talking about. How can people possibly, the reason I got involved in science, and I'm sure the reason you got involved in science and most of the people in this room got involved in science, is that we all felt that by being scientists, we could use the fruits of our research to actually help society. That science is one of the ways that's an unbiased piece of evidence that we can bring to any discussion that can help people make sound decisions. And it just makes me cry when people are viewing science as some big business and some big gain trying to search for big bucks to feed some university machine. That just sucks my soul out to think of that.
Okay, let's take a couple more questions. One in the middle here, Nate.
Hi, Marcia. Since I'm just a visitor here, I can ask maybe hard question for the locals. As you, I'm sure, know, there was a potential precedent-setting issue with respect to a paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that when a rebuttal was published, both the authors of the rebuttal and the National Academy of Sciences were subject to be defendants in a lawsuit. Yeah. That's been since dropped, as I understand it, so you might be free to comment. But it seems to me that this muddies the water, having it unsettled as to me being an editor-in-chief of a journal, Noah being an editor-in-chief, you being affiliated with science and the National Academy that was named in this, as to where the boundaries are when scientists can feel that if they're acting in good faith and publishing a peer-reviewed paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, that they could be subject to a lawsuit as opposed to having it be worked out in the scientific method and not in the courts. What's the Academies, if there are any, position? We just leave this elephant in the room and hope nobody revisits it? Or what do we do here?
So, Nate, as you know, I can't remember where that stands. I think the Academy was thinking of going back because of the way that case was dropped and because of the judge's attitude about it. I think the Academy was going to go back and request that all of the fees that the original authors and the Academy had spent on it be recouped from the plaintiffs because of it being such a frivolous and unwarranted waste of everyone's time. And I think that if that happens, that would be a appropriate deterrent.
Time for one or two more questions. Catherine?
Thank you for all of the remarkable insights from so many leadership positions that you've had. I have a question that kind of bridges your time at USGS and the NAS, and it's really big picture in terms of science being relevant and actionable in DC, across agencies, and for policymaking, decision-making more broadly. What channels work best right now? What channels would you most like to commission other reviews, as you did for the NAS reports? And what new channels might there be for scientists wanting to get out of their bubbles?
Okay, a lot of questions there. Let me see if I got them all. What channels work best right now? Okay, so the channels that the Academy has found that work best right now are the very personal, one-on-one, private communications with individual leaders in DC. So, going to the White House and talking to people in OSTP and people in the various agencies. The news tends to cover a few outspoken people in DC, but remarkably, there are a number of actually well-meaning and qualified people elsewhere in the agencies that are keeping their head down and doing good stuff. And as long as you work with them under the radar, you can actually get a lot done. And doing things too publicly just does not work because that's not good for them and not good for us. But they really know what sort of things they are allowed to get done and can get done and will be just fine. So that's what's working well right now. In addition to the redoing the reports at the Academy, at the same time, I commissioned a review of just our processes at the Academy. And not surprisingly, because you guys are at a university, you know this, the Academy's different divisions that we have, like the Division of Earth and Life Sciences, which is DELS, and the Division of Engineering and Physical Sciences, and all these different groups, grew up kind of like university departments, each with their own culture and their own way of doing things. And now imagine you're a university and each of your departments has their own IT group and they have their own financial management and they have their own comms division, and none of them have worked with each other on how they should, reconcile their books and what, one group might be using one version of PowerPoint and another is using another thing, and you're not all using Word, and you can't exchange documents very easily because you're not using the same software systems, and that's kind of the way the Academy is. And so we decided that the problem we have now that so many of our studies that we're doing are not neatly siloed into any one division, we really need to knock down these walls between these different groups because our administrative processes are just getting in the way. And it's going to be impossible it's just such a heavy lift to do things across these divisions when it's like, the Tower of Babel, everyone's speaking different languages and using different processes and stuff like that. So we've got teams now that are out trying to lower these barriers. And it's not good for the staff either, because if this group has too much work and this group doesn't have enough work, it's really hard for someone over here to be detailed over here when they don't know any of the systems. So we're fixing that. What was your last question?
Well, I feel like it was big enough, but if there's anything new you would want to innovate completely from scratch.
Oh, well, yeah, but that'll be a long, we've got lots of things for innovating.
Over the glass of wine.
Yeah.
Let's take one more question from the middle. No. Wait for the microphone for one. And if there's whoever's got the microphone, thanks, Louise.
One of the many things that you did when you were at Science is you wrote some amazing editorials, and your comments about speaking to leaders reminds me especially of the Lee and Me editorial that you wrote. And, it was conversation starting, it was eye-opening, and at the time you were so optimistic about the role of scientific knowledge in being used for economic progress and development. If I remember correctly, that meeting was initiated by the leader of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Right. And I was wondering if you could just close by reflecting on that meeting and also on sort of the connections that you see between the U.S. Academy of Sciences and other academies of sciences.
Yeah. So, so Bai-Chun Li is still the head of the Chinese Academy. And that is one of, I would say, our two closest connections are with the Chinese Academy and the Royal Society in the UK. Those are the two academies that we tend to do the most with, because I would say we share a lot in terms of our interest in taking on meaty topics and wanting to advance them. So we've had a series of meetings that are trilateral between us and those two academies on the topic of gene editing, for example, particularly when the Chinese got out in front on human embryo editing, and everyone got very concerned. That group was immediately panned for doing something that was considered risky and unethical. And so the Chinese Academy worked with us to hold a summit on what should be science-imposed limitations on human embryonic editing. And we've had some follow-ups that have engaged more academies in this. And we've got another meeting coming up in Hong Kong soon. The Chinese Academy is, of course, different from us. They're more like the old Russian Academy in that they run many research institutes, which, we don't do. But they, and they're more government than either the Royal Society or us. But they have been a very good partner in this. The other academies that we do a lot of work with are, somewhat surprisingly, the Israeli Academy. The Israeli Academy has some very good people in it, and of course they feel a little isolated, being in the Middle East, and so they're very eager for partnerships. So we do work with the Israeli Academy. We do work with the French Academy. I love doing work with the French Academy. The French Academy recently had their 350th anniversary. 350 years, if you can imagine. We had our 150th anniversary not too long ago. And you imagine the French Academy was already 200 years old when we had our 150th anniversary. But anyway, because the French Academy had their first meeting in the Louvre, they closed the Louvre for the anniversary, and we got to tour the Louvre with no one there. So I have a selfie of me with the Mona Lisa, me with the Winged Victory of Samothrace, no one else there, just, my private day at the Louvre. It was lovely. So, yeah, I love the French Academy. That's my favorite. But anyway. Yeah.
Well, let me close with one final question. I suspect it was something you were hoping that I would ask, or that a member of the audience would ask that we did not. And I want to give you a chance to close with a thought that would have been brought forward by the question that should have been asked.
Oh, gosh. probably, what would be my dream for the National Academy at the end of my term as president? What would I like to be remembered for when my term as president is done? So, you know, although I don't myself like to think of what I'm doing in my career, whenever I take on a new job, I do like to think about what is my goal for the organization. So what is it that I'd like to accomplish for this organization, and that I would be loath to leave this job without having accomplished it. And for the National Academy, it's diversification. I really want to leave the National Academy younger, more women, racially more diverse, and geographically more diverse. Because right now it's very bicoastal, it's very male, and right now, absent changing something, the Academy will actually start to shrink because it's electing members older and older every year. And so they're staying in the Academy a shorter time. And so the Academy will actually get smaller every year as they die. So we have to start getting younger people into the Academy, otherwise we're going to shrink.
We'll work on that. Thank you, Marcia.